welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing my August wrap-up. It's a couple days late, but I'm still really excited to talk about all the books that I read in August because it ended up being a pretty decent reading month. I ended up reading 12 things. 4 of the things that I read were books that I was rereading in August, so I read 8 new to me things. And if you watched my August TBR that I posted obviously at the beginning of the month, you'll know that I was doing sort of like a challenge, like a 5-star predictions challenge for myself for the month of August, and I had some mild success. So I'm excited to talk to you about the 12 books that I read in the month of August. I thought I'd switch things up a little bit this month, and instead of talking about the books in order that I read them or in order of my least favorite to most favorite, I figured I would actually talk to you about them in the order of most favorite to least favorite, because I actually have some fairly unpopular opinions, and I think it would be kind of fun to save those for the end. But before I jump into that, I am going to just briefly review the 4 books that I reread in August, because obviously I don't need to review them because I've already read them. I don't really need to do like a full review because I've already read them. This month I decided to reread Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. Obviously the movie came out in mid-August, and I think many people on the bookish internet sort of just got sucked into the Red, White, and Royal Blue world, the Red, White, and Royal Blue fandom. So after I watched the movie for the first time, I decided to reread the book because it's been quite a few years since I read the book. Actually, I don't think that's true. I think I reread it last year, but it felt like it had been a while since I reread it. So I reread it right after I watched the movie, and I still love it. This is obviously a contemporary romance following the first son of the United States president falling in love with the Prince of England. It's just sweet, cute, romantic, and I really enjoyed the movie as well. I didn't love the movie the first time I watched it, but then I sort of just couldn't stop thinking about it, and I rewatched it several times in subsequent days, and it's grown on me quite a bit. So if you haven't read this book, I'd highly recommend it. If you haven't seen the movie, it's on Amazon Prime. I also highly recommend it. And then towards the end of the month, I really just was craving some fantasy romance, you know, those kinds of books that you can just turn your brain off and read. And so I reread the entirety of the A Court of Thorns and Roses trilogy by Sarah J. Maas. I don't love A Court of Thorns and Roses, but I am the kind of person that if I'm going to reread the series, I have to reread them all. I can't just skip one. So I did reread A Court of Thorns and Roses, and then I obviously reread A Court of Mist and Fury and A Court of Wings and Ruin. And it's still an enjoyable series. It's not the best thing that's ever been written, obviously. Sarah J. Maas is not writing any groundbreaking fantasy here, but it's just like candy to me. I eat it up, and I'm not sorry. So, yeah, I reread the series. It's still one of my favorite guilty pleasure fantasy series, and I am very excited to get more books in this world eventually. All right, with all of that out of the way, let's talk about the 8 books that were new to me in the month of August that I read. First off, starting with my favorite book of the month, and probably what is going to end up being my favorite book of the year, or at least in my favorites of the year. And I predicted it in my TBR. I said my favorite book of the year I was going to read in the month of August, and this is a very strong contender, and that is On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is a literary fiction novel about a man named Little Dog, who is writing a letter to his mother, who does not read or speak English, and so he's sort of using this letter to express all of these feelings that he's never been able to really express to her. This is about identity and gender and sexuality. It's about being an immigrant in the United States and what growing up as an immigrant does to a person. It is about this very complex relationship that he has with his mother. It's just a really sweet but also heartbreaking book. I cried a couple of times while reading this. They both had to do with his relationship with his grandmother, which was really sweet. I really enjoyed this, and Ocean Vuong is an author that I could see myself really just falling in love with everything that he's written. He's just got a very lyrical, kind of beautiful, raw writing style that I fell in love with this. I'm gonna reread it at some point. I listened to the audiobook because Ocean Vuong narrates it himself, but I'm so glad that I own this book physically, because there are just so many passages in this book that I would highlight and underline and annotate just because they were so impactful. The writing was gorgeous. I actually did do a vlog at the very beginning of the month. I was going to try to do weekly vlogs throughout the month, but it just didn't work out that way. It ended up being a crazier, busier month than I anticipated. But I did do one vlog at the beginning of August, and I read this in that vlog. So if you want to have my in the moment, real honest thoughts about this book, then I would recommend going and watching that vlog. I think it's going to be in my top 5 books of all time. I'll have to reread it to really solidify that, but it is definitely up there as one of the best books I've ever read. Next up, surprisingly, my second favorite book of the month was one of the last books that I read. Actually, I think it was the last book that I read in August, and it was a YA book. I'm shocked. And that is This Vicious Grace by Emily Steed. This is the first book in a YA fantasy duology about a girl named Alessa who is a Fenestra, essentially meaning that she is this magical being that uses the gift of another person to protect the island that this series is set on. She has to find like the perfect balance to her magic, and she has an array of options, and the problem is that she keeps killing all of the people that she chooses. She has had 3 different partners so far, and they have all died. And so this is sort of like her last chance. She's got one more chance to find the perfect partner. And it sounds like a little bit of a silly premise, but honestly, I really enjoyed this. It definitely took me probably 50 to 100 pages to really get into it. I think that the author took about that much time to really settle into her writing style and kind of the direction that she wanted her story to go. This was one of the coolest books that I've ever read. I was so invested in the magic system. I was invested in the characters. She hires this random guy that she finds on the street to be her bodyguard, and obviously there's a romance because it is a YA fantasy book, so of course she and the bodyguard sort of like have a thing, and I was so invested in their relationship. She can't physically touch people because she keeps killing them, and so she is craving physical touch, and her bodyguard sort of helps her figure out how to solve that problem. I just really loved this. I really enjoyed it. I'm really glad that I read it when I did, because the second book comes out in December, and it's the final book in the duology. So I'm glad that I don't have to wait too long to find out how the series is going to end, because it definitely leaves off on a bit of a cliffhanger. There's so many twists and turns, some things I didn't see coming, and I'm really glad that I read it. Surprisingly, a YA book was my second favorite book that I read this month, and I'm not complaining. I also read Wandering Souls by Cecile Penn, which is a sort of multi-generational story about these 3 siblings who immigrate to Hong Kong and then eventually the United Kingdom from Vietnam. The 3 oldest siblings in this family are the only survivors of this immigration, and so the oldest daughter sort of becomes responsible for her 2 younger brothers, and this book is all about the very complicated relationship that she has with her brothers, the complicated relationship she has with herself, with her country, with her identity, and eventually settling into a new life. I thought it was a very interesting book. I was really invested in the story, and I definitely wanted to know more about the situation. It's set just after the end of the Vietnam War, and a lot of Vietnamese people are trying to leave the country to sort of protect themselves and their families. And so interspersed throughout this book are some actual news articles that were written during that time, and there's also some little anecdotes thrown in about different types of situations that occurred often with Vietnamese refugees. I do think that this was a really interesting book, and it definitely makes me want to learn more about this period in history that I don't really know that much about. But honestly, I do think the book would have worked better if it had been just like a nonfiction book, a series of essays, firsthand accounts of refugee stories. I think that adding in those articles sort of took me out of the story at times, because the articles themselves were a little bit graphic in nature, but those things never happened in the story. And not that I wanted there to be graphic imagery in the story, obviously, but it kind of felt like the author threw those in to say, like, this is how horrible it was, but our characters didn't experience that. I just think it probably would have worked better if it had been like a collection of essays or some kind of like nonfiction historical account of different refugees' experiences. But I did really enjoy this for what it was. I really liked the writing style. I definitely would read more from this author in the future. This was originally put on my radar because I think it was longlisted for the Women's Prize, and it just sounded so interesting to me. So I decided to get it and read it, and I did really enjoy it, and I would read more from this author, like I said. This just didn't end up being like the absolute perfect book for me, so I can't really like give it any more than like 3.5 or 4 stars-ish. Next up, I'm going to talk about The Princess Bride by William Goldman. This was one of the 2 books that I read this month that were on my 2023 TBR. Actually, I don't know that I can really count this as a book read because I ended up listening to the abridged audiobook on Scribd. I have had this book on my TBR for so long, and I love the movie a lot, so I just have never really felt the desire to read the book. Well, I did at one point, obviously, because I bought the book, but then I love the movie so much, and I'm so familiar with it, and I just didn't ever really feel like I needed to read the source material. But I did listen to the abridged audiobook on Scribd, like I said, and it's basically the movie, but just in book form, like obviously, or maybe the movie obviously is the abridged audiobook in movie form. I don't know that I'll ever go back and read and get like the full context. I feel like I understand the story enough having seen the movie a million times. I think it's a lot of fun, but I love the movie. It's like a comfort movie for me. It's like a movie I put on at night to fall asleep to almost every night because it's just so comforting to me. It's just a story that I love, and I'm glad that I read it. I'm glad that I have in some way experienced the book, even if it wasn't like the full text. Next, I'm going to talk about The Queen of the Night by Alexander Chee, which is a historical fiction that was also on my 2023 TBR. This was also on my August TBR as a 5-star prediction, and unfortunately it was not a 5-star. Obviously that's why it's so far down the list. So this follows an opera singer named Liliette Byrne, who was orphaned in America in like the early 1800s, and she finds her way to Paris, where she is trying to reconnect with some family that she has in Europe, and then she gets kind of swept up in all these other misadventures and eventually finds her way to the stage as a really famous opera singer. At the beginning of the book, she is approached by a composer to be the star of a new opera that he is producing, and when she reads the script, she quickly realizes that this opera, is based on her life. Only a handful of people know the actual full story of her life, and so she sets out to figure out who has written this play and what the end goal is. I thought it was going to be a little bit more about like the mystery of who wrote this play, but it just wasn't. The beginning was really interesting because I really enjoyed her backstory. Like I wanted to know more about her, and I thought it was really interesting, like all the different places and people that she encountered as she made her way to Paris. But then once we find out who the actual, like who's behind the opera, things just sort of go downhill for me. Like it just was less interesting. The pacing really stalled out. I just wasn't invested. Like the mystery was what kind of kept me reading, and then once the mystery was solved, there were no stakes to the story, and so I wasn't super invested for like the last probably 30% of the book. I do think the writing is incredible. I thought it was really interesting. I love historical fiction, and so I'm glad that I got around to reading this, especially since it's been on my TBR forever. It's been on like my physical TBR on my shelves for like 6 years, and so I'm glad that I got around to reading it this month. But it just didn't live up to the expectations I had for it, unfortunately, and I'm kind of bummed about that because I did really like build this book up in my head to be this amazing book that it just didn't turn out that way, unfortunately. Next up, I'm going to talk about Vespertine by Margaret Rogerson, which is a YA fantasy book about a girl named Artemisia who, at the beginning of the story, she's living in this convent and she wants nothing more than to become a nun. She wants to be a sister. She wants to help heal people. And then the abbey that she lives at is attacked, and so she takes a revenant into her body to protect her people. And then there is this like priest that is hunting her down because she shouldn't have this revenant in her body. A revenant is essentially like a spirit, a demon spirit almost, that inhabits people to take over the world, essentially. And so she travels to a bigger area, like a big city, and she is looking to find a way to like save herself from this revenant and then also stop what's going on in the land. I didn't love this, unfortunately. I really wanted to because I have loved books by Margaret Rogerson in the past, but this just didn't really do much for me. I found it to be really confusing. The stakes felt very low. I never really got to know who the main character was. I just was not invested in the story at all, and so it was a pretty forgettable read. It was one of the first books I read, if not the first book I read in August, and I honestly can't really remember very much about it because it just didn't stick with me. I had a hard time like wanting to go back to it. Every time I put it down, I didn't really want to pick it up again. I was really just like, every time I was reading it, I feel like I was not really focused on the story, and so I would have to go back and reread stuff over and over because it just wasn't grabbing my attention. I honestly probably should have DNF'd it, but I wanted to give it a fair shot. And now I feel like I've decided that Margaret Rogerson is just an author that was sort of like a one-hit wonder for me. I really loved Sorcery of Thorns, and I just don't think she's ever going to top that. Okay, the last two books that I have to talk about, I'm a little bit nervous to talk about just because they are very popular books on the bookish internet in general, and I had less than positive experiences with both of them, so I'm a little nervous, but I'm just gonna do it. I read Divine Rivals by Rebecca Ross, which is another fantasy book that I didn't realize, and this is on me, like this is totally on me. I didn't realize this was YA. I should have, but I didn't realize that it was YA. So I went into it thinking it was going to be this really incredible adult fantasy, enemies to lovers, war-torn sort of story that follows these two people who are vying for the same position at work. On the side of that, they're also communicating with each other via these magical typewriters, but the catch is that they don't know that they're talking to each other. So they're rivals at work, but then at home they are falling in love through these letters. Such an interesting premise. Like, that is enough to hook me. Unfortunately, the execution is not there. I recognize that I am so the outlier on this opinion because everybody seems to love this. And that was a big reason why I ended up picking it up, is because it has gotten such great reviews. Like, it is so hyped, especially like on Book Talk. I really wanted this to be like a new favorite book for me, and it was not. It was not at all. This is marketed as enemies to lovers. Disagree wholeheartedly. At best, rivals to lovers, and that lasts all of about 5 minutes before they are declaring their love for each other. I mean, yeah, the relationship could be really sweet and romantic, but it was not enemies to lovers. I couldn't root for them because it was so insta-lovey. Like, I had no reason to be invested in their relationship because they had built no foundation. Also, one of the characters does know that they're talking to each other, and it felt a little bit like lying by omission to not reveal that information to the other character. And so when it is revealed, the character has every right to be mad that this other person has lied to them, and then it's just all forgiven within 5 minutes and they're back to being in love with each other. And I wanted to love it. I wanted to. The only redeeming factor of this book for me was the writing style. Rebecca Ross is very lyrical, and her prose is so lush, and I was so invested in the setting of the book. Like, I was very interested in the world around them. I didn't give a shit about the characters, but I cared about the setting. I cared about the world. All of that being said, I will be reading the sequel because it's only a duology. The sequel comes out in December, and it does leave off on a big enough cliffhanger that I just really want to know how it's going to end. So even though this is one of the most disappointing books I've ever read, I will be reading the sequel just because I need to know how it's going to end. And obviously, now that I know it's YA, I can go into the sequel with some different expectations, and I feel like I will feel differently about it because I will be able to temper my expectations a little bit. Like I said, I'm the complete outlier on this, so definitely take my review with a grain of salt. If this sounds like it's interesting to you, I would definitely recommend giving it a go, because most people, like 99% of people, seem to be liking it, seem to be loving it, like a new favorite book of all time. It just didn't work for me, unfortunately, but it will probably work for you, so I'd give it a go. And the final book that I have to talk about in this video, I'm so nervous to talk about it, is Babel by R.F. Kuang. So this is about a boy named Robin who, when he's a child, he is brought from Canton to England to start studying language and translation. And then when he turns 18, he is given the opportunity to go to the Oxford Institute of Translation to essentially further translation in the world. This particular institution is called Babel, or Babel, I think in the book is how they pronounce it, is kind of like the hub of the use of magic in this world. The magic system revolves around the use of silver and translating different match pairs onto silver bars to make things happen. Essentially, he has lived his whole life in sort of this bubble of wealth and knowledge, and then when he gets to the university, he starts to learn that things aren't necessarily as he's always been taught, and in fact the United Kingdom, the Crown, is bad and is using people of color to further their own advancement in like silver working at the detriment of third world countries. And so it's all about how colonialism is bad, obviously, but also Robin feels such a loyalty to this college that has given him everything. And so he's sort of split in two, and it's about him grappling with these different facets of his identity. The idea for this is so cool. Like, this is such an interesting premise, and you can really tell that R.F. Kuang loves language. Like, this book feels like a love letter to language and translation and what words do for people in the world. I did not like this. I really actively disliked reading this book because, number one, R.F. Kuang gives her readers no credit for figuring out the message of this book, which is colonialism is bad. White people are bad. It's just, yeah, she hits you over the head with it for the entirety of the book without giving the reader any credit to figure any of that out for themselves. The only real character that gets any kind of like development or agency in the story is Robin. Every other side character, which there are many, exists in this book only to further Robin's characterization. There's not really any like real development of the side characters other than their relationships and their connections to him. I feel like there were some very interesting side characters that I wanted to know so much more about, but that I just didn't get the opportunity to know because they didn't have the kind of interactions with Robin that the author wanted to develop. Yeah, this book overall for me was just a big disappointment. Like, I can respect what the author was trying to do, and I can appreciate the message that the author was trying to send without just loving the execution of the story. So unfortunately, this is again one of the most disappointing reading experiences I've ever had. This, while not being like the worst book I've ever read, will probably be on my worst books of 2023 just because I expected so much more from it, and I know that it's so well loved, and I am so glad that people love it. This is just sort of making me realize that R.F. Kuang just isn't really an author for me. I just don't love her stories. I don't love the way that she tells stories. I have read The Poppy War by her, and while I think that book is also very interesting and has such a cool premise, I hated the execution of it, and I don't think I'll ever continue on with that series just because I have no desire to keep reading about those characters in that world. I can appreciate what she's doing for literature without wanting to consume her stories anymore. Yeah, I just think that reading this was just very telling for me to just appreciate R.F. Kuang from a distance and not continue to consume her stories. So that's what I've decided to do. So yeah, those are the 12 books that I read in the month of August. Overall, a pretty decent reading month. I do wish that I had read a couple more 5-star reads, a couple more books that I could very confidently say are going to be on my favorites of the year, but there's still a few months left of 2023, so we still have plenty of time to find some new favorite books. I'm really hopeful for the books that I have picked out for September. I'm really in a fantasy mood right now, and so I'm just like, I'm riding that train until it kicks me off. And so I'll probably be reading a ton of fantasy in September, or at least like the first half of September. Let me know down in the comments if you read any of the books that I mentioned in this video and what you thought about them. If you have similar or different opinions to me, I'd really love to know. Also, let me know some books that you read in the month of August, or maybe your favorite book that you read in August. Let me know your favorite and your least favorite book that you read in August, because I need to add more stuff to my TBR. Obviously, I need to find more things to love. So let me know all the things down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you again very soon. Bye!